I am Nigam Nuggehalli. I am the Dean of the Law at BML Munjal University. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the domain of law, especially tax law. I'll begin by talking a little bit about me and my life journey, about the domain of tax and what it entails, what it takes for a student to do well in this area, and what are the career options in this field. I am very interestingly in this legal ecosystem, one of the throwbacks to an era when there were no national law schools in the country. I was the fifth batch of the National Law School Bangalore in 1992, when law was still a profession that was not considered as a profession that was an alternative to engineering and medicine. Very different from today, where the law in India is a vibrant profession with plenty of opportunities, both in litigation and in corporate law and commercial law. When I graduated from the National Law School Bangalore, I was looking for opportunities in higher education. I wanted to do something more in legal academia rather than get into practice immediately. So I spent a couple of years abroad. I was in Canada for a year at Queen's University, researching on international economic laws and foreign investment laws. It was an exciting time at that time for us. We had the liberalization program finally coming to some kind of conclusion. As we all know now, it's history for you, it was current events for me. And 1991 was the time when India started liberalizing its economy. And by the late 90s, it was in full swing. Everybody, especially lawyers, were in the middle of it. So it was an interesting time for us to do some research on the Indian foreign investment regime, which is what I did in Canada for a year. And then I spent a very exciting 1 year in New York City doing my LLM in tax at New York University. Now, New York University has the world's preeminent tax program, not just for foreign graduates, but also for its American law school graduates who want to become tax lawyers. Some of the best tax lawyers in America have come from the New York University LLM graduate program in tax. I was privileged to be a part of that program. Very tough program. I had a great year in New York City. Manhattan is a great place to live, I think, for young people. And it was a wonderful experience to the American legal system. And I could make interesting comparisons actually with the Indian legal system. We share a common law heritage. We share, and the heritage comes from the fact that the English legal system influenced both the systems, but there are important differences in the law. And it was really interesting for an Indian law graduate to notice how different and how similar the American legal system is to the Indian legal system. I completed my graduate studies in tax law in New York, and I wrote and passed the New York bar exam. So I was part of the New York legal fraternity in the early 2000s, and I joined a Canadian law firm in their New York office. In their tax department. So I was a tax associate working on international tax matters, mostly in US Canadian tax treaty issues. And I did that for a few years. And then I thought I should teach for a bit. So I actually came back to India for a year. I taught at the National Law School, taught tax law at the National Law School. So it was interesting coming back to my alma mater. And this time not as a student, but as a professor. And then I thought I should get into legal academia full time. It was important for me that I take the next steps to migrate, so to speak, from practice to academia. So I applied to various institutions, and I finally chose Oxford University. Once again, transition for me. I'd never been to England before. My experience had been Canada and the US. And then it was interesting to spend very many years in England, first as a PhD student, at Oxford University. So I did my PhD, and this time the PhD was in legal philosophy. I'll come to that bit a bit later, and then also as an academic at BPP Law School, now BPP University in London for a few years. So all in all, I spent 16 years abroad. I spent 6 years in New York and 10 years in London, and both parts of those lives kind of led to interesting perspectives, I think, on both legal practice and on academia. The Oxford stint was not in tax law, interestingly, it was in legal philosophy. I've always been attracted to legal philosophy, and in some ways, I think all tax lawyers are kind of philosophers in the sense, because they're making sense of or conceptualizing a certain area of law that is complex, and that doesn't make sense unless we really think of it in terms of an application of principles of tax law. And Oxford is a great place for legal philosophy. It's a kind of place where there are 8 legal philosophers in the law faculty. So you can imagine how interested and how important philosophy must be to the Oxford Law faculty. And then I founded the Munjal Law School in 2019 in July, and since then I've been at the Munjal Law School. So my, as you can see, my experience has been across various areas. It's been both in terms of domains and in terms of geography and areas of interest. I think it's important for students to understand that the domain of law, while being considered as a homogeneous domain from the outside, is actually quite varied from the inside, right? So there are various areas of law in which people are specializing, and that specialization has actually taken on a more formal feature in the last few years. So there are specializations in intellectual property, there are specializations in tax law, corporate law, international law, and other areas. Now, of course, data protection and technology laws. And there are various specializations in law that are coming up in the past few years. So there's been a bit of a segmentation in the field. At the same time, it's important for potential law students to understand, and potential law aspirants to understand, that there are certain fundamental features of the law that traverse all these domains, right? Without which your understanding of any of these domains is going to be incomplete. So a person, regardless of whether he or she wants to be a tax lawyer or an IP lawyer or a corporate lawyer, has to understand contracts, trusts, tort, and constitutional law. If you don't understand these 4 areas, in addition to property law, if you don't understand these areas, then you are not able to understand completely any of the domains of the law, right? So it's important, therefore, that for aspirants to understand that they need a bedrock of legal knowledge on which to build their respective specializations. Having said that, as I said, the way the legal industry is going, there is now increasing segmentization, there's an increasing specialization in various fields, and tax law is one of them. Tax law in any country will largely consist of statutory law. Right? One can't impose taxes on citizens unless you can impose it through a legislation. So in India, it is the Indian Income Tax Act 1961, and similarly in other countries, there are tax legislations. And the reason for this is constitution. Each of the constitutions, of course, England has an unwritten constitution, but each of the constitutions of these countries prescribes or lays down that you can't impose a tax without having a law behind it. And that's the reason why we go to, in these countries, to the statutory law that actually imposes an income tax or indirect tax on its citizens. Tax law is fascinating for that reason. It is statutory in character. It has lots of complex interlocking sections and clauses, somewhat in many cases counterintuitive in nature, but which requires interpretation and application, as I said previously, of general principles of tax law in order to ensure that the whatever provision we are talking about works well in practice. Tax law, therefore, is an exciting field for this reason, that it is at the heart of every commercial transaction. In fact, if you just open a newspaper today and you read about any transaction, especially any international transaction, you will notice that the words used are, these transactions are tax driven. They are tax driven because tax considerations, how to minimize taxes, are at the heart of the deals that are being struck by lawyers and by businessmen across the globe, in India, United States, UK, across the globe. Tax law has two dimensions. There is a domestic dimension. Each legislation has got a domestic impact. For example, the Indian Income Tax 1961 is being used by the revenue to impose taxes on persons, individuals, and companies within the country. At the same time, tax law has an international dimension in the sense that tax law will be imposed whenever services and goods are exported or whenever there is a commercial relationship between people working in different countries. At that time, we have something called tax treaties that come into operation. And these are treaties meant to ensure there is no double taxation. Where there are tax treaties, there are international tax lawyers. So there are lots of law firms across the globe who advise clients on how to interpret tax treaties and ensure that taxes are being filed efficiently and with minimum taxation. There's plenty of tax planning both at the domestic and at the international level that goes on in this field. I have worked in an international tax law firm. I've advised people both on domestic and international tax issues. There's no single day when I think that tax law is uninteresting. There's always some new interesting issue that comes up in this area. For students who like complexity, who like logical analysis, who like creativity, there is no better field than tax law. But I must warn you, tax law is, as I said, only one piece of a larger puzzle, right? And the larger puzzle is the commercial transaction, right? And therefore, for a tax lawyer, any tax lawyer, to do well in this area, he or she should know the other allied domains of the law. He or she should know contract law, tort, property, constitutional law, and therefore a tax lawyer, it's important for a tax lawyer to be a good commercial lawyer in the first place. What kind of students should look out for areas of this sort? Students who, as I said, love logical analysis and complexity, are creative, imaginative, have some comfort with numbers, because tax law ultimately comes down to numbers. Students who want to know more about tax law in their law school, it's important that they take a few steps which will give them some idea of what to do with this domain. One easy thing to do is to intern with law firms or accounting firms who are working in this area. As I said, there are various firms and accounting firms that have tax departments. All the major law firms in India have tax departments that do exclusively tax law. All accounting firms have dedicated tax departments. So it will be a good idea for students to intern in these places. My advice would be to intern in the 4th year after you've done your tax law, so that you're not all at sea when you go and work at these places. But I think if you are interning in your 4th or 5th year, it might be a good idea for you to do it at these places. As I said, there are plenty of places that do it, so it's not as if there's going to be only a few select places that choose these kind of interns. It's important for you to express an interest in this area. The other thing, in India particularly, is blessed with a number of, I would say, almost daily talks and conferences and lectures and tax law. And there are, and these happen at various levels. All the chartered accounting associations have regular lectures on income tax and GST. all you have to do is just follow the CA professional bodies, and you will notice on the web, and you will notice the conferences happening. Many of these conferences are open to the public, they're free. So it's easy to go and attend these conferences. In fact, the Bombay Chartered Accountants Association does both regular online tax conferences, and it also has residential tax conferences where people can actually go to the city if you're really interested in a particular subject and attend it. There's usually for professionals, but I see no reasons why students can attend it as well. In addition to that, there are tax bodies, for example, the International Finance Association and other professional tax bodies that hold annual conferences and biannual conferences. It mostly happens in Mumbai. Bombay is the center for tax law. And students, many of these conferences have special packets for students to attend these conferences at a very subsidized rate. And more interestingly, they have essay competitions for students, where a student can write a tax paper or a tax essay, and that essay will be presented at the conference. It's a great opportunity actually for young students. It wasn't there when I was a student, so I miss it. But it's a great opportunity for young students to write an essay and actually get rewarded for it and be able to present it at a tax conference. So please be on the lookout for that. These are again widely advertised. So there's no, if you're on the lookout, you'll easily understand where these are coming from. And they usually happen annually or biannually, and you can go and present your papers there. In addition to that, there are avenues for higher education. I mentioned one of it, which is the LLM in tax at New York, but there are avenues for higher education in tax law, which people can explore either immediately out of law school or after a few years of your practice, you can do that. Internationally, there are three highly valued LLMs in tax law. The one at NYU, the one at Harvard Law School. Harvard Law School, it does not have a tax exclusive LLM, but it has an LLM in which there are really good tax courses. So we've got some really good lawyers from the Harvard LLM program. And there's an LLM in tax law at Georgetown in Washington, DC, which is also highly valued. So these are the three kind of LLM programs that internationally are well recognized. And we have actually had a number of Indian students who have been to these LLM programs and who have come back and practiced in this domain in India. So it's important for you to have some comfort with accounting and numbers, but you're a tax lawyer, and as a tax lawyer, the actual number crunching will be done by accountants. So you're not going to be doing all the number crunching. In fact, you're not going to be doing most of the number crunching, but you've got to have some sense of what a tax bill looks like, what a balance sheet looks like, what's profit and loss. Those kind of concepts you need to understand in order to ensure that you are able to give your clients a good piece of tax advice, right? So I think tax law in some ways is underrepresented in law schools. It's a lot of law students are not aware of how important tax is in commercial transactions and are not aware of the opportunities that are available to law students after they graduate in this area. Remember that in addition to legal practice, all the major accounting firms have a flourishing tax practice. So the big four accounting firms and other accounting firms have a separate tax division doing both direct tax and indirect tax and international tax. And these are mainly tax advisory departments. They're actually advising their clients on how to structure their transactions in a way that is efficient from a tax point of view. So a person who specializes in tax law, who does tax law in law school and maybe even does a higher degree in tax law later on, is attractive not just to law firms, but also to accounting firms. And it is kind of this confluence of different professions that makes tax law even more enriching. So the career options, in my opinion, after tax law for a student lie in a variety of subjects or a variety of domains. as I've already told you before, it lies in accounting and law firms, both domestic and international. This is important because of the important international dimension of tax law, there are plenty of international um, job opportunities that are available to a student who goes on to become a good tax lawyer. And that's just, I'm talking about right now, legal practice and accounting firms. In addition to that, there is something called tax policy, both domestic and international, and a number of think tanks and policy bodies require people to do work in tax policy. And by tax policy, I mean how to design tax legislation, both income tax and things like GST and sales tax and excise tax. Plenty of international tax bodies are involved in this as well. The IMF, for example, is a leading player in tax policy. So is the OECD. In fact, you would have read, if you open the newspapers in the last 6 months, you would have read that there is a big, huge movement led by the OECD G20 countries on how to restructure the international tax system. And that's what they're doing basically is international tax policy. The OECD, including India, OECD and G20 countries are involved in a massive rehaul of international tax policy. And the other area in which we need people, tax scholars, is obviously academia. There are very few tax academics in India, right? And there are many across the globe, especially in the United States and in England, but in South Asia, not just India, in South Asia, we have very few tax scholars. We will need tax scholarship in the future. All of you would have heard about the midnight session in 2017, when the GST was introduced, a radical overhaul of our tax system, right? Introducing an entirely new concept in India. How many scholars in GST are there in India right now? If you'll ask me, there are very few, right? So we have a radical crores and crores of tax revenue overhaul in India on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have very, very few, I can count people on the fingers of my hand. There are very few tax scholars in India who we can consider as scholars in GST, right? So there's, going forward in the future, the next 10 to 20 years, we will need a number of tax professionals in law firms, in accounting firms, in tax policy think tanks, and in the academia. Only because of the fact that first, we have very few of them, and second, as you can see, it doesn't need a person of wide knowledge, it just needs a person who looks at the newspapers every day. You will need plenty of tax experts, tax professionals, and tax scholars in this field. So tax law, therefore, is an exciting domain, and I'll end by saying this, that there are two things exciting about tax law. One, of course, there's a need for tax professionals and tax scholars, and therefore it's a vibrant, booming area of law. And on the other hand, the second reason is that it enables you to show your expertise in understanding complex legislation, right? So that's the generality of tax law that's important, right? And that's exciting for students, right? It's a matter of interpreting a statute, right? So on the one hand, it is very specific, and there's a big need. And on the other hand, what it really needs are experts in statutory interpretation. And it is, I think, a combination of these two that makes this an exciting domain of law. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to all of you today. And if you need to contact me for anything, please do so.